So, Steven Universe. If you grew up watching Cartoon Network in the 2010s, there's a decent chance this show left a mark on you that you still haven't fully figured out. It's one of those things where you'll be going about your day, completely minding your own business, and then Stronger Than You will appear in your head from absolutely nowhere. And you're just gone for the next 20 minutes, lost in it. I don't make the rules. What we're doing tonight, or this afternoon, or whatever time of day or night it is where you are, is going through 150 facts about Steven Universe. Some of them are about the show itself, the characters, the lore. Some of them are about the people who made it, the voice actors, the composers, the creator herself. Some of them are small production details that I find genuinely interesting. And some of them are the sort of things that only matter if you already love the show. In which case, yes, they absolutely matter. This isn't really structured as a big dramatic reveal situation. There's no grand thesis I'm building towards. It's more like sitting down with someone who's spent a lot of time with this show and just letting them talk about it at a relaxed pace, which is kind of the whole idea. There's a lot to cover, is the thing. The show ran for nearly a decade if you count everything. The original series, a film, an epilogue miniseries, songs that somehow ended up on the mainstream music charts. A composer duo hired for their first television job who'd never worked in animation before. Voice actors stepping into animation for the first time alongside genuine Broadway legends. A creator who threw away her designs twice before the thing even aired. I find all of that interesting, and we'll get into most of it. A few things worth saying up front. I'm assuming you already have at least a passing familiarity with Steven Universe. Not that I'm going to leave you completely lost if you don't. Context gets added where it's needed. But I'm not going to stop and explain who every character is from scratch every time they come up. If you want to go in completely fresh, maybe come back after you've watched it. Or don't. Either way, you're welcome here. Also, if you're finding this relaxing and you'd like to see more of this kind of thing, subscribing does genuinely help. But no pressure. You do whatever feels right. Right. 150 facts, let's just sort of drift into it. The show began, as many things do, as something quite different from what it eventually became. Rebecca Sugar, the creator, wrote a short story years before Steven Universe existed, and that story was called Ballad of Margot and Dread, which is a great title. Very different energy from Steven Universe, but stay with me. The story was about a sensitive child helping teenagers work through problems they couldn't quite put into words. Feelings they had, but no language for yet. There's no magic in it, no alien gemstones, no beach city. But if you squint at it in the right way, you can see the emotional core of the show already sitting there in that description. A kid who connects with people, a kid who helps. That instinct to reach out and try to understand is absolutely central to who Steven is as a character. Even if the short story about teens with feelings went through several thousand plot developments on the way to becoming boy befriends alien warriors in a seaside town. In 2011, Cartoon Network's Vice President of Comedy Animation, a man named Curtis Littlash, asked the staff at the network to pitch new show ideas. Rebecca Sugar was working at Cartoon Network at the time as a storyboard artist on Adventure Time, and she was one of the people in that room. She shared her early ideas for what would become Steven Universe. The project was chosen for development, and that, in a fairly ordinary pitch meeting, is how it started. For a while after that, Sugar was working on both shows at the same time, still contributing to Adventure Time while also developing Steven Universe. The final episode she worked on for Adventure Time, Simon and Marcy, she described as genuinely difficult to work on, partly because she was essentially running two creative lives simultaneously. Simon and Marcy is one of the sadder episodes of Adventure Time, and the timing of working on it while launching an entirely new show sounds exhausting in a very specific way. When the show was commissioned in 2012, Rebecca Sugar became the first woman to create a show independently for Cartoon Network in the network's roughly 20-year history. That was the description used at the time. She later came out as non-binary in 2018, and the more accurate description became the first non-binary person to solo create a show for the network. Either way, it was a first. The main character, Steven Universe, is based loosely but genuinely on Sugar's younger brother. His name is Steven Sugar. And yes, the show is named after him. Rebecca kept asking her brother during development whether naming the show after him was okay. She asked him repeatedly, apparently, over a fairly long stretch of time. He kept saying it was fine. She stopped asking when the show was officially commissioned, which you get the impression was less, I've asked enough, and more, it's too late now anyway. Her brother, for the record, had no objection and trusted her to use his name well, which seems like a reasonable thing to trust your sister with. Steven Sugar, the real one, the human, the brother, went on to work as a background artist on the show itself, so his name is in the credits, of the show named after him. That's a lovely thing that happened. He was also, at around the same time, a background artist on Pendleton Ward's web series Bravest Warriors. Pendleton Ward being the creator of Adventure Time, the show Rebecca Sugar was working on when she pitched Steven Universe. Small world, or at least a small corner of the animation industry. Beach City, the fictional seaside town where the show is set, is based on real places, specifically Rehoboth Beach, Bethany Beach, and Dewey Beach in Delaware, places Rebecca Sugar visited as a child. There's something about that detail that I always find kind of touching. That the town where Steven Universe lives, where all of this cosmic, magical, alien drama unfolds, is grounded in the actual memory of childhood summer holidays in Delaware. You can see it in the atmosphere of the place. The boardwalk, the slightly worn-in quality of it, the way everything smells like sunscreen and old wood if you let your imagination run with it. The boardwalk layout of Beach City was drawn out in actual map form by Steven Sugar, the brother who wanted the town to feel geographically consistent. You could walk through it and the layout would always make sense. He drew where the roads went, where the shops were relative to the Crystal Temple, how the water tower sat in relation to everything else. The influence for this approach was Akira Toriyama's manga Dr. Slump, which features a small contained environment where the characters all live and work, and which always feels like you could draw a map of it from memory. Steven Sugar wanted Beach City to have that same quality of being a real place with real spatial logic, not just a series of disconnected sets. After the show was commissioned, Rebecca Sugar redesigned essentially everything, the characters, the world, the visual language, specifically to make it more flexible and simple, easier for other artists on the production team to draw and to add their own ideas to. The guiding principle was that it needed to be a system that other people could work within freely, rather than something so idiosyncratic that only Sugar could render it accurately. This is partly why the characters in the pilot look noticeably different from how they look in the series. They went through a significant rethink between those two stages of production. The visual standardization process was overseen by Danny Hines as lead character designer, working with both Rebecca Sugar and other artists to establish clear design rules for each character. The challenge was making simplicity feel expressive, finding the minimum number of visual elements needed to make a character instantly recognizable, then making those elements carry personality. The show's characters are drawn with relatively few lines, relatively clean shapes, and yet they're immediately distinctive and readable from any angle at any scale. That takes real craft to achieve, and Hines' approach made it reproducible across an entire production team. The pilot caused some genuine anxiety in the crew when they compared it to what the full series had become. It was different enough that there was real worry about whether the audience would follow. The pilot had been popular when it was released. It generated forum discussions and anticipation, especially from people who already knew Sugar's work from Adventure Time. That positive response reassured the crew that they could take the show somewhere bigger. But the pivot was still a leap of faith. The pilot was first shown publicly at San Diego Comic-Con in the summer of 2013, before the series premiered. It was also shown at the New York Comic Con in October 2013, with a dedicated 30-minute panel hosted by Sugar herself. Those early convention screenings were a significant part of building the initial audience for the show. Cartoon Network uploaded an edited version of the pilot to their official website and Facebook page on July 20th, 2013. This was relatively early for a major network to do a proper social media preview of a new show. It still felt like a slightly experimental distribution strategy at the time. It also happened to work quite well. The series officially premiered on November 4th, 2013, with 2 episodes back to back. Not a single episode, not a big special, just 2 regular length episodes back to back on a Monday night. Gem Glow and Laser Light Cannon. The first episode is about Steven trying to summon his gem weapon using a Cookie Cat ice cream sandwich. The second is about a giant eyeball robot threatening Beach City. Both 11 minutes long. Both, in retrospect, already quietly laying down details the show would return 2 years later. That's Steven Universe in a nutshell, really. Nothing is accidental. One thing worth mentioning before we move on, the gap between the pilot's visual style and the series' visual style is genuinely striking if you watch them back to back. The pilot has a rougher, looser quality. The characters are slightly more angular. The background's more impressionistic. The whole thing a bit scratchier. The redesign that happened during development smoothed everything out and gave the show the rounded, clean pastel aesthetic it became known for. Some people prefer the pilot aesthetically. There's something appealing about that scratchier quality. But it's easy to understand why Sugar and the crew decided it needed to be more flexible and consistent for a long-running production. You can't ask 20 different people to draw something and have it remain coherent if the original design is idiosyncratic enough that only its creator can replicate it accurately. Rebecca Sugar leaving Adventure Time to launch Steven Universe was also a more complicated transition than it might sound. She'd been a significant contributor to that show. She was one of the main storyboard artists and had written several episodes that are considered among Adventure Time's best. The final episode she worked on, Simon and Marcy, is an emotionally devastating episode about loss and memory and the bonds that hold people together across enormous stretches of time. She described working on it while simultaneously getting her new show off the ground as genuinely exhausting, which is understandable. Simon and Marcy is not a light episode to be living inside your head for weeks at a time. It's one of those episodes that gets you. The Adventure Time connection also explains some of the visual DNA you can find in early Steven Universe. There's a particular kind of softness to the background art, the color choices, the slightly dreamy quality of outdoor scenes that echoes what Adventure Time was doing at the time. Both shows were pushing against the harder outlines and more saturated palettes of earlier Cartoon Network animation, moving towards something more painterly and atmospheric. The influences flowed both ways. Several people who worked on both shows carry that cross-pollination in their work. Now, let's talk about the characters, specifically the crystal gems themselves, the main 4, the people Steven lives with, the ones who are technically responsible for his welfare, despite having extremely variable success at that job. The crystal gems are described in the show as ageless, genderless, alien warriors who project female humanoid forms from magical gemstones at the core of their being. That description, genderless but presenting as women, was an intentional choice from very early in development. The genderless aspect gave the show room to explore ideas about identity and selfhood without being constrained by how human gender works. It's one of those foundational decisions that seems small in the abstract, but ends up mattering enormously for what the show was eventually able to do and say. Garnet is a fusion. If you've watched the show, you know this. If you haven't, Garnet, the tall, stoic, sunglasses-wearing leader of the crystal gems, is actually 2 gems in a permanent state of fusion. 2 separate beings who love each other so much that they've chosen to exist as one. The show kept this secret for the entire first season and a half. The reveal, in an episode called Jailbreak, that closed out season 1, is still one of the most celebrated moments in the show's history. It recontextualizes everything you'd seen Garnet do and say up to that point, and it lands completely differently the second time through. Garnet being a fusion of ruby and sapphire, two gems who are unambiguously in love, means that her entire existence is, on one reading, a metaphor for a same-sex relationship made physical. Sugar has confirmed this explicitly. Garnet isn't just a character who represents queer love. She is structurally, literally composed of it. Every scene where she exists is a scene where that love exists. That's a beautiful piece of writing. Garnet is voiced by Estelle, the British singer and songwriter, probably best known internationally for American Boy. Cartoon Network approached her directly for the role and she said yes. It was her first voice acting job, which, given how much the character sings and how much weight those songs carry, is remarkable. I think about that fairly often, someone with Estelle's musical background being asked to voice a character who has some of the most emotionally powerful songs in the show, and her just doing it brilliantly. Stronger Than You, in particular. We'll get to that later. As a thank you, Rebecca Sugar illustrated the cover of Estelle's music album True Romance. That's not a standard arrangement, that's a personal gesture, the kind of thing that happens when two people genuinely like each other and appreciate what the other does. Pearl is voiced by Dee Dee Magno-Hall, who is primarily known as a stage musical actress. She was part of the original cast of Miss Saigon, amongst other things, and that theater background gives Pearl a very specific quality. There's a precision and a formality to Pearl's voice, a controlled musicality that makes complete sense for the character once you understand who Pearl is and what she's been through. Hall came to animation for the first time with this role, which you would never guess from the performance. Amethyst is voiced by Michaela Dietz, and if you're keeping count, yes, this is the third main crystal gem, whose voice actor came to animation for the first time on this show. Garnet, Pearl, Amethyst, that's not a budget decision. That's Sugar finding exactly the right person for each character, regardless of their CV in the medium, and it paid off 3 times over. The lead character designer on the show was a man named Danny Hines, and his primary reference for how characters should look was the work of Disney animators designing Mickey Mouse. Not Mickey Mouse specifically, the philosophy behind Mickey Mouse. The idea that a character should be simple enough, standardized enough, instantly recognizable from any angle, that anyone picking up a pencil should be able to draw them. That ethos is all over Steven Universe's character designs, the shapes are clean, the silhouettes are distinctive, the proportions are consistent. Hines initially proposed 24 human character designs to the production team. Rebecca and Steven Sugar together drew 22 designs. Of those, 13 were made official for the series, which means there are at least 9 character designs sitting in a folder somewhere that never made it to Beach City. Sugar's vision for how the crystal gems related to Steven was specific and interesting. Not parental figures, not mentors in any traditional sense, more like siblings. Older, more experienced, technically more capable in most situations, but fundamentally operating on the same level as Steven rather than above him. The dynamic she was going for was lateral rather than hierarchical. That family structure, sideways rather than top-down, gives the show a different emotional texture than most animated shows about a child and a group of older guardians. Pearl as a character has significant autobiographical elements for Sugar. Pearl's devotion, her difficulty letting go of someone she loved, the way she organizes herself entirely around someone else's existence. Sugar has described these as things she drew from her own emotional experience. Not one-to-one, but real. That kind of personal honesty in a children's animated show is rare, and I think it's part of why Pearl resonates so strongly with so many viewers. Amethyst was formed in something called the Prime Kindergarten, an underground gem-growing facility in what appears to be the American Southwest. Kindergartens, in the show's mythology, are places where gems are grown by drawing energy and minerals from a host planet. Amethyst spent too long in the ground before emerging, which left her considered defective by homeworld gem standards. Smaller than she was supposed to be. Different from the template. The show introduces this piece of information very slowly over multiple seasons, and it does quiet, significant work on your understanding of why Amethyst is the way she is. Amethyst's particular combination of bravado, self deprecating humor, and occasional profound insecurity maps very naturally onto what it feels like to grow up being told you're not quite right, not quite the right size, not quite the right shape, not quite what was expected. She compensates with volume and chaos. She acts like she doesn't care. She cares enormously. The show is honest about all of this without ever being heavy handed about it, which is the right way to handle it. Her relationship with Steven is one of the show's most uncomplicated loves. They goof off, they eat strange food together, they watch bad television. She teases him mercilessly and also clearly adores him. When Steven's struggles in the later seasons start to surface, Amethyst is often the first to notice something's wrong, even if she doesn't always know what to do about it. She recognizes the particular shape of someone who's learned to perform being fine. Garnet's visual design was the most consistent of any main character across the show's run. She changed the least between pilot and series, and she changed the least over the 5 seasons. There's something right about that. Garnet's whole thing is stability, knowing who you are, being certain in yourself. It tracks that her design wouldn't drift. Steven's gem is on his stomach, his navel specifically, the same place a belly button would be on a human. This is not accidental. Steven is half human and half gem, and the gem literally sits where his connection to the human side of his biology would have been. His mother's gemstone replaced what would have been his umbilical connection to her. That's a detail that's easy to overlook, and once you notice it, you can't unnotice it. Zach Callison auditioned for Steven by speaking 10 lines of dialogue from the pilot and singing the theme song. He got the part. It was his first lead role on television. Callison was around 14 or 15 when the show started, and the show ran for roughly 6 years, a significant portion of his actual adolescence spent voicing a character who was also growing up. That overlap between the actor's real experience and the character's fictional one is unusual, and I think is part of what makes Steven feel authentic in a way that's hard to pin down exactly. As the show progressed and Steven aged within the story, Callison's real voice was changing. The crew used this intentionally. Rather than trying to smooth over the natural deepening of his voice, they incorporated it, letting Steven's voice crack and settle in the same way real voices do during adolescence. By the later seasons, Steven sounds noticeably older, and that gradual change is real, not performed. The show grew up with the person voicing it. There's something worth sitting with in that last point. The show ran from 2013 to 2020, with the original series concluding in 2019. Callison was around 14 or 15 when it started. By the time Future ended, he was in his early 20s. He spent his entire adolescence voicing a character who was also growing up, and the show's story explicitly tracks Steven's emotional and psychological development from childhood into young adulthood. The autobiographical dimension of that is unusual and probably contributed to the authenticity people perceive in Steven's journey. You can't entirely fake the experience of actually going through something. The design philosophy behind the crystal gems as a family unit is also worth dwelling on a little longer. Sugar's decision to position them as siblings rather than parent figures gives the show a specific kind of emotional honesty that parental relationships often can't have. Siblings can be wrong in front of each other. They can be fragile. They can need things from the youngest member of the group that a parent figure would never need from a child. The crystal gems need Steven in ways that are real and not entirely comfortable. They need his optimism, his capacity for connection, his ability to see the best in people. A parent can acknowledge needing those things from their child in a gentle, philosophical sense. A sibling can need them in a way that's urgent and embodied. The crystal gem's dependency on Steven creates dramatic tension that a more conventionally parental relationship would have had to work around. The characters' individual designs also encode their histories in ways that the show never fully explains in dialogue. Pearl's color scheme, pale, soft, white and blue and gold, is associated throughout gem lore and human iconography with perfection, purity, and something slightly cold. Amethyst purple hues connect to royalty in human color symbolism, but in the show's mythology connect to something that came from the earth that was formed underground and emerged into the light. Garnet's deep reds and blues are the fusion of her component gems made visible, ruby's red, sapphire's blue, merged into a warm violet presence. The visual design did the character work quietly, before any episode ever explained it. Since we've been talking about the gems as characters, it's worth spending some time on the actual world they come from. The gem mythology in Steven Universe is genuinely elaborate, the kind of lore that clearly existed in full before most of it was revealed to the audience. You get the feeling, watching the show, that Sugar and her team knew the history of Homeworld and the diamonds, long before any of it was shown on screen. The breadcrumbs are there from very early on, if you know to look for them. But talking a bit about the mythology before we get into individual characters, because the world of Homeworld and the Gem Empire is one of the more carefully constructed fictional mythologies in recent children's animation, and it rewards the kind of unhurried examination we're doing tonight. Gem Society operates on a rigid caste system determined entirely by what kind of gem you are. Your gem type determines your role, your rank, your options, and your value to the Empire. Diamonds are at the absolute top, the rulers, the authority, the definition of perfection in gem culture. Pearls serve the upper castes. Rubies are soldiers, common, expendable, not particularly respected. The hierarchy goes all the way down, and there's no mobility within it. You are what your gem says you are, and that's the end of the conversation. Or, it's supposed to be, anyway. The Gem Empire, under the Diamond Authority, engaged in interstellar colonization as a matter of routine. They would find planets suitable for gem production, hollow out parts of the crust to build kindergartens, grow new gems from the planet's resources, and move on, leaving the planet depleted and often unable to sustain organic life. This is presented in the show not as an act of villainy per se, but as the way things have always been done. The gems genuinely don't register it as wrong because they've never been taught to consider organic life as mattering. Earth was assigned as Pink Diamond's first colony approximately 6,000 years before the events of the series. Pink had been asking for a colony for a long time, apparently. She was the youngest diamond, treated a bit like a child who keeps asking for something and finally gets it. The assignment was Earth. Pink Diamond arrived on Earth and became genuinely enchanted by it, by the organic life, by the complexity and variety of a living planet. She disguised herself as a common Rose Quartz gem, going incognito, essentially, to explore Earth without the protocol and ceremony that came with being a diamond. And in doing that, in actually walking around and seeing the planet she was supposed to be destroying, she developed a conscience about it. The colonization she was supposed to be running was going to kill everything she'd come to love. The biggest twist in the entire run of the show is the revelation that Rose Quartz, Steven's mother, the legendary leader of the Crystal Gem Rebellion, was Pink Diamond all along. They were the same person. Pink Diamond faked her own death to escape Homeworld, convinced Pearl to shatter a Rose Quartz gemstone projection in front of witnesses, and reinvented herself as Rose Quartz permanently. The other diamonds believed Pink was dead. The Crystal Gems believed they'd achieved a genuine victory. Only Pearl knew the truth, and she had been made to swear she would never tell anyone. This is revealed in a Season 4 episode called A Single Pale Rose, through a series of nested memories inside Pearl's gemstone. Memories within memories within memories, Pearl having buried the truth so deep that accessing it required going through multiple layers of her own consciousness. It's one of the most formally inventive sequences in the show, and as a revelation, it cracks the entire series open. Everything you've seen before reads differently after that episode. The recontextualization is enormous. Every time Rose Quartz appeared in flashback, every time her motives were discussed, every time the question of what was she really like came up, all of it shifts. Because Rose Quartz was a diamond running away from who she was. A person who had spent thousands of years constructing an identity that let her live with herself. The show doesn't let this be simple. She did genuine good as Rose Quartz. She also caused genuine harm. Both of those are true. What the show does with Rose after this revelation, in the remaining episodes and in future, is also worth sitting with. She doesn't become a villain retroactively. She doesn't become a saint. She becomes complicated in the way real people are complicated. Genuinely loving and also deeply flawed, capable of extraordinary care and also of significant selfishness. Someone whose good intentions coexisted with her capacity for harm. Stephen spends most of future processing what it means to be her son. The corruption of the gems on Earth, which the crystal gems spend a significant portion of the series trying to understand and reverse, was caused by a combined attack from Yellow, Blue, and White Diamond at the moment they believed Pink Diamond had been shattered. Their combined grief, expressed as a massive planet-affecting sonic attack, corrupted every gem left on Earth who wasn't sheltered in time, including many gems who had nothing to do with the war. The corrupted gems, the crystal gems, fight throughout the series. The monsters they're trying to contain are former soldiers and civilians from both sides of the gem war, reduced to animalistic forms by the diamond's anguish. That's not a comfortable thing to sit with. White Diamond, the most powerful of the three remaining diamonds and the implied ultimate authority of the entire gem empire, is essentially absent from the show until late in season 5. When she does appear, she's startling. Her design is stark and maximalist. And her voice, Christine Ebersole, has a specific quality of absolute, unquestioning certainty that's more unsettling than anything conventionally villainous the show has done. She's not evil in the way cartoon villains are evil. She's just wrong, completely and profoundly, about what reality is. Yellow Diamond was voiced by Patti LuPone, the Broadway legend, the 2-time Tony Award winner, the person many consider one of the greatest theatrical performers alive. Her song, What's the Use of Feeling, Blue, is a villain song technically, but it's really a grief song. Yellow Diamond coped with losing Pink by converting her grief entirely into productivity and contempt for emotion. The song is her rationalizing that to Blue Diamond in real time. Patti LuPone sings it in a way that makes it feel genuinely operatic, which is exactly what it needs. Blue Diamond was voiced by Lisa Hannigan, the Irish singer-songwriter, best known for her solo work and her long musical partnership with Damien Rice. The contrast between Blue and Yellow's voice casting says something about how the two characters cope differently with the same loss. Blue is still immersed in grief, soft and weeping, in a way that Yellow has burned out of herself. Lisa Hannigan's particular quality of voice, tender, slightly fragile, fits Blue in a way that's almost too perfect. White Diamond was voiced by Christine Ebersole, who alongside LuPone has 2 Tony Awards of her own. The decision to cast 3 Broadway heavy hitters, LuPone, Hannigan, Ebersole, as the 3 diamonds was clearly intentional. The diamonds needed to feel like forces of nature, like beings of enormous presence, and you need serious vocal weight to pull that off. The casting is, quietly, brilliant. Kindergartens, the gem production facilities, leave physical marks in the landscape. The holes in the rock walls where individual gems were grown remain after the gems have emerged. In the show, when Stephen and Amethyst visit the Prime Kindergarten, they're walking through a landscape of thousands of these holes, each one the birthplace of a specific gem. Amethyst knows exactly which one is hers. It's an oddly affecting moment, standing in the place you came from, looking at the specific indent in the rock that used to be your whole world. Peridot was introduced in the first season as a villain, a technician from Homeworld sent to Earth to assess the status of the cluster, a Homeworld geo-weapon buried deep in the Earth's mantle. She's precise, imperious, condescending, and completely unprepared for what she finds on Earth. Her slow, awkward, often funny process of adjusting to being on Earth, befriending Lapis Lazuli, and eventually aligning herself with the crystal gems is one of the show's most satisfying arcs. She goes from antagonist to full crystal gem, and the journey is entirely earned. Lapis Lazuli, by the time the show begins, has been trapped inside a mirror for thousands of years. Not dormant, conscious, aware. She was a gem who was captured during or just after the Gem War and imprisoned in a mirror that was then used as a communications device. The people using the mirror had no idea she was inside it. She was essentially a prisoner being used as a tool, conscious the entire time for millennia. The show introduces this gradually, and the weight of it lands slowly. Her trust issues, once you know the context, are not surprising. There's a specific quality to the way Lapis is written that distinguishes her from the show's other traumatized characters. Pearl's grief is, at least in part, a grief that can be worked through. She had something real, even if what she had was complicated, and she can process its loss. Lapis's situation is different. She wasn't loved and lost. She was simply taken, imprisoned, forgotten, and used. The absence of any relationship, the blankness, where a meaningful connection should have been, is its own kind of wound. The show handles that distinction with care. The cluster, the homeworld geo-weapon buried inside the Earth, is a massive forced fusion of thousands of shattered gem shards, each shard still retaining some awareness. The idea is that if it awakens, it will grow to the size of the Earth itself and tear the planet apart from the inside. Stephen communicates with it through a shared dream space and helps it understand what it is, and it agrees to bubble itself. This entire storyline, which takes up a significant portion of Season 3, often gets overshadowed by the bigger character revelations. But the cluster is a remarkable piece of world building. The idea of a weapon made from the shattered remains of people, still barely conscious, trapped in forced proximity forever. The horror of it is significant. Fusion, the ability of gems to merge their physical forms and create a new, combined being, is used throughout the show as an extended metaphor for relationships, not just romantic ones. Healthy fusions feel like genuine collaboration, like something greater than the sum of its parts. Unhealthy fusions, like malachite, the fusion of jasper and lapis, feel like two people trapped together through power imbalance and resentment, each trying to assert control over the shared body. The show uses fusion to explore codependence, abusive dynamics, love, trust, and the way relationships can either elevate or diminish the people in them. That it does all of this through action-adventure animated sequences is genuinely impressive. Bismuth is a crystal gem who had been bubbled, imprisoned in suspended stasis by Rose Quartz herself, long before the events of the series. When Stephen releases her in Season 3, she doesn't know Rose is gone. She's overjoyed to be free, to reunite with the crystal gems. And then the episode reveals why Rose imprisoned her. Bismuth had created a weapon capable of permanently destroying gems rather than just poofing them, and when Rose refused to use it, Bismuth attacked her, and Rose had to bubble her to end the fight. Rather than tell the crystal gems what had happened, Rose bubbled Bismuth in secret and said nothing. It's one of the show's most morally complicated moments. Bismuth's argument that the only way to end the war was to be willing to permanently destroy the enemy is not obviously wrong. Rose's refusal is principled, but it also cost the rebellion enormously, and she dealt with the fallout by making a unilateral decision and hiding it from everyone. The episode doesn't fully resolve the tension, it just sits with it. That ambivalence about Rose Quartz is one of the things Steven Universe does better than most. The show is clearly invested in her as a figure of importance. She looms over everything, and it's also unwilling to let her be simply heroic. She made the rebellion possible. She also suppressed information, managed people's perceptions of her, and left behind a series of truths that her loved ones had to discover painfully long after she was gone. That's not villainy, but it's also not the uncomplicated nobility that the early episodes suggest. The show builds the mythology and then earns the right to complicate it. The Gem War itself, the conflict between the crystal gems and Homeworld that preceded the events of the series by thousands of years, is fascinating in the way the show reveals it. You don't get a clear, clean account. You get pieces, flashbacks from Pearl, Garnet's recollections, historical records that turn out to be incomplete or distorted, the physical evidence left in the landscape. The war is always somewhat obscured, somewhat partial, seen through the memories of people who each experienced it differently, and each have things they're not saying. History as it actually feels to people who lived through it. Not a clear narrative, but a collection of overlapping, sometimes contradictory experiences. The homeworld's relationship to Earth as a colony project that was abandoned when the Diamonds believed Pink was dead, left Earth in an interesting liminal state in the show's mythology. The kindergartens are still there. The gem tech is still embedded in the landscape. The corrupted gems are still wandering. Earth is a planet that had a war on it, and all the infrastructure of that war is still present, slowly being reclaimed by organic life. Beach City sits on top of layers of ancient gem history that most of its residents are completely unaware of. That geographic and historical layering, the ordinary human town built above an alien war zone, gives the show's slice-of-life moments a quality of quiet resonance that pure fantasy wouldn't have. Since we're on the topic of the Diamonds and the Broadway casting, it makes sense to drift into the voice cast more broadly. There's a lot of interesting detail here, both in terms of who was cast and how they came to the show, and in terms of how the recording process worked, which was unusual enough to be worth talking about. Tom Sharpling voices Greg Universe, Steven's father, the human rock musician who lives in his van. Sharpling is primarily known as a comedian and podcaster, most notably as the long-running host of The Best Show. He's also a television writer and producer. Critics specifically called out his performance as one of the strengths of the show's voice cast. One review praised his specific style, and the warmth he brought to a character who could very easily have been one note. Greg is a man living in his van, perpetually slightly broke, still genuinely in love with his memories of Rose Quartz, and somehow one of the most stable and emotionally healthy adults in Beach City. That combination requires a particular kind of performance, and Sharpling nails it. Grace Rolick voices Connie Maheswaran, Steven's best friend, the one human who knows about the crystal gems, and eventually a sword-fighting partner who trains under Pearl. Critics noted she was singing her heart out in the show's musical episodes, which tracks because Connie's story in the show involves her finding her own voice in quite a literal sense. Connie is bookish, careful, slightly anxious in social situations, and completely willing to throw herself into danger when the people she loves need her. Grace Rolick gives her a groundedness that keeps Connie from feeling like she's just along for the ride. Shelby Rabara voices Peridot in her recurring appearances throughout Season 2 and beyond. Rabara's performance tracks Peridot's journey from imperious homeworld technician to flustered, slowly warming crystal gem ally, with real specificity. The moment in Season 3 where Peridot calls Yellow Diamond a clod directly to Yellow Diamond's face on a live communication channel to try to protect the Earth is delivered with such committed panic energy that it's become one of the show's most beloved moments. Jennifer Paz voices Lapis Lazuli. Lapis is a character who carries enormous weight, thousands of years of imprisonment, a tendency toward depression, a complicated relationship with whether life on Earth can actually be good for her. And Paz brings a quality to her that's hard to define but immediately recognizable. Quiet, slightly distant, occasionally warm in ways that feel hard-won. The show was explicitly storyboard-driven, which is a specific production approach that makes it quite different from most animated shows. In a traditional animated show, writers write scripts, and those scripts go to animators. In Steven Universe, the process worked like this. Writers produced episode outlines that covered the story framework. Those outlines went to storyboard artists, who drew the scenes and wrote the actual dialogue as part of the storyboarding process. Then, only after the storyboards were complete, a production staff member wrote out a formal script, which was used for the recording sessions. The storyboard artists were, functionally, also the dialogue writers. This gave the show a different texture to its writing than you'd get from a traditional writer's room. During recording sessions, voice director Kent Osborne and Rebecca Sugar would work with actors using the actual storyboards as reference. They'd walk actors through scenes visually, pitching what was happening in the frame, what the emotional context was, rather than just handing them a script and letting them figure it out. This is unusual and adds a collaborative quality to the recording that you can, I think, hear in the performances. The actors knew what they were playing against. Nicki Minaj voiced Sugalite, the fusion of garnet and amethyst. Sugalite is enormous, loud, overwhelmingly powerful, and barely controllable. She's apparently the highest paid single voice performance in the show, which tracks. Sugalite only appeared in 2 episodes across the entire series, but she made an impression. Sugalite's 2 appearances are worth examining briefly. The first is her introduction in Season 1, where she's presented as thrilling and then frightening. The power of the fusion starts consuming the individual personalities, and she becomes something neither garnet nor amethyst really is on their own. The second appearance is much later, more settled, and feels like a different kind of fusion, the same component gems, but the relationship between them has changed enough that the fusion feels different too. It's a subtle thing and easy to miss if you're not looking for it. Fusion, across the show's full run, is used to track the state of relationships in ways that work as both plot mechanics and emotional barometers. When Pearl and Amethyst fuse into Opal, their combined form, the quality of the fusion changes depending on how aligned they are in that moment. Early Opal appearances feel slightly effortful, slightly unstable. Later appearances, after those 2 characters have genuinely worked through some of their tensions, have a different quality. The fusion system is doing narrative work about the characters' relationships at all times, even when the episode isn't explicitly focused on those relationships. It's a storytelling tool that the show uses with real sophistication across its entire run. There's also the case of Steven's own fusions, which the show introduces relatively late and handles with care. Steven fuses with Connie to form Stevani, a fusion the show uses to explore questions of identity, adolescence, and what it feels like to exist in the space between 2 people. Stevani's episodes have a specific dreamlike quality that's distinct from any other part of the show, and the show doesn't rush to explain what Stevani is or what the fusion means. It just lets Stevani exist and trusts the audience to feel what that existence means. Susan Egan voices Rose Quartz. Rebecca Sugar has said explicitly that she created the role of Rose Quartz with Susan Egan in mind. Egan is known as the original Belle in the Broadway production of Beauty and the Beast, and she has a specific quality, warm, certain, slightly larger than life, that gives Rose Quartz exactly the right kind of mythological presence. Rose is mostly seen in flashback throughout the series, heard in recordings, remembered in other people's descriptions of her. She looms enormously over the entire story while barely being present in it, and Egan makes that work. The Diamonds casting, Patti LuPone, Lisa Hannigan, Christine Ebersole, is a deliberate creative decision. The Diamonds needed to feel like the most powerful beings in a galaxy-spanning empire. They needed voices that carried that kind of weight. Casting 3 extraordinary Broadway and theatrical voices achieved that without requiring any of them to be conventionally menacing. They don't need to sound threatening. They sound like the kind of people who have never in their lives been told no. Several members of the main voice cast have described the recording sessions as unusually warm and collaborative, and specifically mentioned that Sugar was frequently present. Many animated shows record voices with the actors in isolation, guided only by a voice director and a script. The involvement of the showrunner in recording sessions gave Steven Universe's recordings a different quality. The actors could ask questions, could understand context, could respond to Sugar's vision directly. The collaborative atmosphere extended to how songs were recorded as well. Dee Dee Magno Hall has spoken about how Sugar would be present for musical recordings, guiding the emotional intent of each phrase, explaining what a particular note needed to carry. For an actress with Hall's stage background, where the relationship between a director and a performer in a musical number is collaborative and iterative, that approach would have felt natural. The performances in the show's songs have a specificity that comes from this kind of directorial intimacy. Zach Callison has also spoken about how his experience recording Steven evolved over the years of the show. In the early seasons, Steven is enthusiastic, optimistic, sometimes exhaustingly positive. In future, Steven is struggling in ways that require a very different kind of performance, quieter, more internal, carrying weight that early Steven didn't carry. The through line of the character across 7 years of recording required Callison to track a genuine emotional arc, not just hit notes in individual sessions. The diversity of Beach City's population as a visual and casting choice is something Sugar and the team were explicit about. The show's human cast, the Beach City residents, reflect a range of ethnicities, body types, family structures, and personalities. It was intentional, and it was done without fanfare, which is the right way to do it. Zach Callison, Michaela Dietz, Dee Dee Magna Hall, and other cast members have performed live at San Diego Comic-Con panels on multiple occasions over the years. This included singing, often without elaborate backing tracks or production support, just voices and a microphone, in front of a room full of fans. The 2017 SDCC panel included what's been described as a memorable duet between Sugar and Estelle. I wasn't there, but by all accounts it was the kind of thing that makes you feel good about being alive. Kevin Michael Richardson voiced several characters across the series, including Jasper, a homeworld gem soldier who functions as a recurring antagonist in the first few seasons. Richardson has one of those voices that can do an enormous range, from warm and gentle to genuinely imposing, and the show uses that range. One more production to win detail about the recording sessions that I find interesting. The storyboard panel numbers, rather than scene headings or action descriptions, served as the navigation system in the recording script. So rather than NT Crystal Temple Day, you'd have a panel number corresponding to a specific image in the storyboard. The actors were essentially navigating a visual story in number order. That's a very specific way to record dialogue, and it says something about how deeply visual the whole production process was. Greg Universe as a character is, in some ways, the most interesting human in the show. He's the person who loved Rose Quartz as a human loves someone, with mortality, with limitation, with the awareness that the relationship was asymmetrical in fundamental ways. Rose was thousands of years old. Greg was a young man living in a van. She would outlive him by an enormous margin. The child they had together would outlive him by an even larger margin. Greg knows all of this, and it doesn't make him bitter or resentful. He just loved her, and he loves Steven, and he plays guitar in a car wash he owns, and is generally one of the more emotionally healthy people in the show. Tom Sharpling gives him a warmth that makes that choice, to be at peace with an inherently asymmetrical situation, feel authentic rather than passive. There's also the matter of Greg's backstory, which the show reveals gradually across several episodes. He was born into a wealthy family. His birth name is Greg DeMeo, which he changed to Greg Universe in the rock musician phase of his life. And he walked away from that security to pursue music. He loved music more than money, which is admirable in theory and extremely hard in practice. And he lived the extremely hard in practice version of it for a long time before the show begins. By the time we meet him, he's genuinely at peace with where his life went, which is either the most zen thing in the show or just the result of loving two people so much that the rest of the ledger doesn't really matter. Maybe both. The guest casting throughout the show was, on reflection, consistently excellent. The Diamonds were a landmark choice, but the smaller guest appearances were also made with care. Patti LuPone, Christine Ebersole, and Lisa Hannigan all deliver performances that completely earn their presence in the show. None of them are stunt casting. They're not there to be recognizable names. They're there because those voices do something specific and necessary for those characters. That's the right reason to cast a guest. Now, let's talk about the score, because the music of Steven Universe is genuinely one of the most interesting things about it, and it deserves more than a paragraph. The show's incidental score, everything that isn't a song with lyrics, was composed by a duo called Ivy and Surashu. Ivy Tran is a pianist and composer. Stephen Velima goes by the name Surashu and is an electronic musician and sound designer. The two of them had, at the time they were hired for Steven Universe, absolutely no experience working in television or film of any kind. They got the job because of a recommendation from Jeff Liu, a storyboard artist and also an in-house composer on the show who was familiar with Ivy's work. She had been composing music for an indie video game called Cry Amore, and Liu had heard it and thought, this is the person Rebecca Sugar should talk to. So he mentioned it to Sugar. Sugar approached Ivy, who suggested that Surashu might audition alongside her as a duo. She thought they'd be stronger together, and she wasn't sure she could handle the workload alone. Sugar agreed to the joint audition. By Ivy and Surashu's own account, they weren't entirely sure they could manage the pace of television production. It was a bit of a leap. Their audition consisted of scoring a clip from Gem Glow, the show's first episode. Two of the cues they produced for that audition, one called Steven's Shield and one called The Mother, were used in the actual episode. Their audition became the show's score. That's a lovely bit of serendipity. The first music you hear when the series begins is literally the music these two people made while hoping they'd get the job. Sugar's original brief for the score was theatrical and video game inspired, capturing the show's particular balance between the ordinary and the extraordinary, between a kid hanging out at a donut shop and the fate of the cosmos. Both Ian Jones-Cordy, the supervising director in the early seasons, and Sugar herself collaborated closely with Ivy and Surashu in establishing the musical language of the show from the beginning. Every main character in the show has a leitmotif, a recurring musical theme associated specifically with them. These themes aren't static. They shift and evolve depending on context, mood, situation. A character's theme under duress sounds different from their theme in a quiet domestic moment. The underlying melody is the same, but the instrumentation, the tempo, the register all change. It's the kind of compositional sophistication you associate with film scores or serious television dramas. And it's doing quiet work every time it plays, whether you consciously notice it or not. There's a specific moment in season 2 where Steven and Pearl have a quiet conversation and Pearl's leitmotif plays, but it's in a minor key at a slower tempo than usual, with a fragility to it that the same melody in a more confident context doesn't carry. The music is telling you something about Pearl's internal state in that scene that the dialogue is only gesturing toward. Ivy and Surashu understood the show's emotional architecture well enough to deploy that kind of precision consistently, which is not something you can do accidentally. Within the duo, there's a loose division of responsibility. Ivy handles Pearl and Steven's music primarily. Surashu handles Garnet and Amethysts. They swap sections and build on each other's work before finalizing anything. Each adds to what the other has laid down. It means no character's music is entirely one person's creation, which feels right for a show about collaboration and fusion. Ivy's major influences in game music include the Nintendo composers, Koji Kondo in particular, who wrote the scores to the Mario and Zelda games. She's also a fan of Yasunori Mitsuda, Chrono Trigger, Kazumi Totaka, Animal Crossing, and Masashi Hamauzu. Super Mario Galaxy is cited as a specific influence. If you know that score, the way it mixes grandeur with playfulness, the orchestral sweep of it, you can hear where it feeds into the show. Surashu's primary influence is Shoji Meguro, the composer of the Persona 3 and Persona 4 video game soundtracks. Meguro has a very specific sound, melancholy, atmospheric, slightly jazzy in the late night city kind of way. That influence is audible in Steven Universe's heavier emotional cues, the ones that have a quality of quiet weight to them. Their production pace was genuinely rapid. Each episode's score was composed, produced, and delivered in approximately 1 week, start to finish, move on to the next episode. A pace more like a game jam than a film score. That speed, that constraint, produces a certain kind of energy in the music. It stays lean. There's no padding. Guitars on the score were played by a musician called Stamage, a guitarist who works extensively in the video game music community and brings that particular precision and warmth to the show's sound. When you hear a solo guitar moment in Steven Universe, and there are several, that's Stemage. Ivy and Sarashu got married in 2015 during the run of the show. They call themselves a perma-fusion, which is a gem reference, permanent fusion. Two entities that have chosen to exist as one. It's the kind of thing where you either find it enormously charming or roll your eyes. And I find it enormously charming. They mean it both playfully and genuinely, which is the right way to mean things. The first Steven Universe soundtrack album, Soundtrack Volume 1, was released on June 2nd, 2017. It compiled music from the first 4 seasons. It debuted at number 22 on the Billboard 200, an unusual position for a children's show soundtrack. It also reached number 1 on the Independent Albums chart and number 2 on the Soundtracks chart. Volume 2 followed in 2019 and charted similarly well. Those numbers are worth sitting with for a moment. For a Cartoon Network show soundtrack to chart that high. The audience engagement with the music specifically, not just the show, had to be substantial. People were listening to this score as standalone music, the way you'd listen to an album you loved. In 2022, Ivy founded an independent record label called Infloresce Records as a way of supporting other composers and creating a community for personalized music. The label's first album, Infloresce Volume 1, Floral Folklore, included tracks from artists signed to the label, with Ivy and Sarashu contributing a track called My and the Snake. Sarashu mastered the album. Ivy served as album director. It's a natural extension of the collaborative ethic they brought to Steven Universe, using their platform and expertise to create space for other people's music, rather than just producing their own. In 2023, they released a second full album. Meanwhile, originally intended as a sequel to their 2013 debut album, The Black Box, but which shifted during development into a reflection on the time that had passed between the two albums. The years of Steven Universe, the years after. It received positive reviews, though less widespread attention than The Black Box had. The 10th anniversary edition of The Black Box was also released in 2023, with 7 new tracks and a limited vinyl run. There's something fitting about that coincidence, the career that Steven Universe helped build, producing new work a decade after it all began. The glockenspiel appears prominently in several of the show's gentler character themes. It gives certain scenes, particularly quiet, domestic moments, a delicate music box quality that's very specific to this show. It shows up in Pearl's theme especially, and in some of Steven's solo moments. There's something about that instrument in this context that makes it feel like a small, fragile, precious thing being carefully handled. Love Like You, the song that plays as the end credits music across many episodes, was written by Rebecca Sugar and introduced in partial form very early in the series. The full lyrics weren't heard until much later in the run. The song is written from the perspective of someone who is overwhelmed by how much someone else loves them, and who can't quite understand why they deserve it. It's quietly devastating if you read it in the context of the show's mythology. We'll get to more on that song in the next section. The range of the score, from genuinely silly rubber chicken comedy cues to emotionally devastating orchestral moments, is one of Ivy and Sarashu's most impressive achievements. The transitions between those registers are seamless. An episode can move from a goofy Steven moment to a gem revelation scene to a quiet domestic exchange, and the music tracks every shift without any of the tonal whiplash feeling jarring. That kind of tonal flexibility is genuinely difficult to achieve in a score, and it requires either perfect calibration or perfect intuition about the material. Probably both. The choice to use chiptune elements, the distinctive sound of vintage video game audio, 8-bit and 16-bit synthesizer tones, Throughout the score is a considered aesthetic decision that connects the show to a specific cultural moment and a specific emotional register. Chiptune has associations with childhood, with early gaming, with a kind of uncomplicated joy and nostalgia that suits a show fundamentally about growing up and about the places you carry from childhood into adulthood. But Ivy and Sarashu's version of Chiptune isn't retro kitsch, it's blended with contemporary production and piano in ways that feel current and warm rather than ironic. The nostalgia is present, but it's not the point. The leitmotif system is worth elaborating on a little, because it does a lot of quiet narrative work. Stephen's theme is warm and curious. There's something slightly wondering about it, a melodic openness that reflects his fundamental orientation toward the world. Pearl's theme has a precision to it, something organized and slightly formal, with an undercurrent of something that might be longing, depending on the context. Garnet's theme is grounded and steady, and when you know Garnet is a fusion, you can sometimes hear the two component themes present within it, layered rather than resolved. The music is doing character work at all times, even in background scenes, even in the quietest moments of an episode. And since we've arrived at Love Like You, let's talk about the songs themselves. All of the original songs in Steven Universe were written by Rebecca Sugar, which is an unusual amount of creative control for one person on a show of this scale. The songs are not decorative. They do structural work. They carry things the dialogue can't. Rebecca Sugar wrote every original song in the series herself. The process involved her writing and recording rough demos on ukulele, just her voice and the instrument, and then sending those demos to Ivy and Surashu to be fully produced. She would walk them through each section of the song, explaining the emotional intent, what she wanted each part to feel like, what the moment in the episode needed. They would divide the arrangement between them, build on each other's parts, and then bring in live musicians for specific instrumentation. That workflow, rough ukulele demo through to full production, with Sugar guiding the emotional vision at every step, produced a particular intimacy in the final songs. You can hear the human voice in them. The compositions are polished and musically sophisticated, but the emotional core of them traces back to someone sitting with a ukulele trying to express something. Stronger Than You, sung by Estelle as Garnet, became the show's most culturally significant song. It plays during the climactic fight of Season 1, Garnet versus Jasper, and it's a song about what Garnet is, an act of love, two gems choosing to be together in a world that would forbid it. Critics described it as a power ballad. It's also a genuinely excellent piece of musical writing. The way the melody builds, the way Estelle's delivery goes from controlled to fully committed by the end of it. No notes. What's the Use of Feeling, Blue, performed by Patti LuPone as Yellow Diamond, is technically a villain song but functions as a grief song. It's Yellow Diamond telling Blue Diamond to stop feeling things, to convert the loss of Pink into productivity and purpose, to stop indulging sadness. Everything Yellow Diamond does in the show flows from this logic. She decided at some point that grief was weakness, that moving forward was the only option, and she's been running ever since. The song is Yellow Diamond revealing her entire coping strategy in 3 minutes of operatic reasoning. Patti LuPone makes it sound absolutely inevitable. It's over, isn't it? Is Pearl's solo in Season 3. It's Pearl, at the height of her grief over losing Rose, processing the knowledge that Rose chose a human life, chose Greg, chose to become Steven, and trying to understand how she's supposed to carry on. Dee Dee Magno-Hall's performance won a GLAAD Media Award for Outstanding Musical Moment. It's the kind of song that earns that recognition not through spectacle, but through restraint. It's small, precise, and devastatingly specific. Mr. Greg is a full musical episode. The third season contains this extended, fully staged musical sequence, where Greg, Pearl, and Steven work through years of unspoken grief and resentment through a series of songs. Sugar has said it's her favorite episode in the whole series, because she had always wanted to work on a musical, and this episode let her do that. The episode has the structure and emotional logic of a real stage musical compressed into 11 minutes. Sugar has been composing and performing music since long before Steven Universe. She studied at the School of Visual Arts in New York and was posting piano compositions and songs to YouTube and SoundCloud years before the show began. The musical dimension of the show isn't something she acquired for the job, it was already there. In 2015, Sugar returned to Adventure Time to write the music for a miniseries called Stakes, a Marceline-centric story arc. She wrote the song Everything Stays for that arc, and she also voiced Marceline's mother in it. Everything Stays has become one of the most loved songs from either show. A gentle, deeply melancholy song about the way things change even when they seem to stay the same. It's remarkable how different it feels from the Steven Universe songs, and how clearly it comes from the same person. When Rebecca Sugar was born, her parents had considered naming her Nora. She used the name Nora later as Steven's female alter ego in a season 4 episode called Lion 4 Alternate Ending, an episode where Steven watches a video his mother left him and imagines what his life would have been like if he'd been born differently. The name Nora for that alternate universe version of Steven is a small personal detail sitting quietly in the mythology of the show. Here Comes a Thought, a song performed by Steven and Connie in season 4, set during a mindfulness exercise that uses the visual framework of fusion, became one of the show's most practically useful songs after it aired. Teachers and therapists began using it with children as a resource for emotional regulation. The song teaches a grounding technique, noticing intrusive thoughts as thoughts, letting them pass in a form that's genuinely accessible to children. Sugar consulted with mindfulness experts before writing it. The animation that accompanies Here Comes a Thought is worth describing briefly because it's doing a lot of work. The thoughts Steven and Connie are struggling with are visualized as small, intrusive figures, butterflies that swarm and multiply when resisted, and calm and drift away when simply acknowledged. The visual metaphor is accurate to how anxiety functions. The more you try to suppress an intrusive thought, the more powerful it becomes. The song teaches the alternative approach, noticing, naming, not fighting, through both its lyrics and its images simultaneously. The fact that this exists in an 11-minute cartoon episode for children is remarkable. Change Your Mind, the title song of the season 5 finale, is essentially the thesis of the entire series compressed into a few minutes. Steven addresses White Diamond directly, makes the case that he is his own person rather than a vessel for who his mother was. And the song becomes the emotional climax of everything the show has been building toward for 5 seasons. Sugar wrote it as exactly that, a synthesis, the show's argument made explicit in musical form. In September 2023, Sugar released her first solo personal album, called Spiral Bound. It was described as inspired by 3 years of journaling and sketching during a period of recovery from what Sugar called extreme burnout and unresolved trauma. It's a personal album in the most literal sense, private, introspective, made for the process of making it, rather than for any external purpose. There's something very right about that existing. The person who spent years making art that helped other people process difficult feelings eventually made some art specifically to help herself, going back to Love Like You for a moment, because I promised we would. The song is sung from the perspective of someone who finds the love they receive overwhelming, almost incomprehensible. The narrator can't understand why someone would love them as they are. They can see everything they're not, every way they fall short of the person they're supposed to be. And they're baffled that the love exists regardless. If you read it as Pink Diamond, a being who was told for her entire existence that she was wrong, too small, too emotional, too attached to the wrong things, who eventually ran away from her own identity entirely, rather than keep being something that didn't match who she was inside, the song becomes almost unbearably specific. The full version, heard late in the show's run, ends with the narrator wanting to deserve the love they've been given. Not just to receive it, but to be worthy of it. That is Rose Quartz's entire project. expressed in a song that played over closing credits episodes before most viewers had any idea who Rose Quartz really was. It's worth also mentioning Drift Away, a song that appears in Steven Universe Future and is about exactly what the title suggests. It's about the appeal of disconnecting, of letting yourself become someone simpler, of the way trauma can make oblivion feel preferable to consciousness. It's quite a dark song for a children's franchise, delivered with the same melodic gentleness as everything else, and it fits perfectly into what Future was doing thematically. Sugar knew where the music needed to go. The function of music in Steven Universe overall is different from how music works in most animated shows. It's not just background or scene setting or emotional punctuation, it's narrative infrastructure. The songs advance plot, reveal character, change relationships, and mark turning points that dialogue couldn't achieve with the same specificity. The show trusts its songs to carry weight that other narrative tools would struggle with. That trust is earned and it pays off consistently. Since we've been talking about the songwriting process, it makes sense to zoom out a bit and look at the production of the show more broadly. How episodes went from idea to screen. Some of these details are fairly technical, but they give you a sense of the scale of what was being done here on a week-to-week basis. Each episode of Steven Universe takes approximately 6 months to produce. Start to finish, from the initial pitch in the room through to the final airing. 6 months for 11 minutes of animation. That's not unusual for animation as a medium, but it's worth saying plainly, because it recalibrates your sense of what's involved. Every episode you watch represents half a year of ongoing work by a team of people. The animation was produced overseas primarily by 2 South Korean studios, Sunmin Image Pictures and Rough Draft Korea. Rough Draft Korea is one of the most established animation production studios in the world. They've worked on The Simpsons, Futurama, Samurai Jack, and many others. The overseas production model is standard in animation, but requires careful supervision and communication to maintain visual consistency, especially across a show with as many distinctive characters and settings as Steven Universe. The production workflow went like this. Animation was drawn and inked on paper in Korea, then scanned and colored digitally. After that, the production team held work print meetings, where they reviewed the completed episode for errors before it was sent back for corrections. Minor animation mistakes were fixed by the crew. More significant errors went back to the studio or to Cartoon Network's post-production department. The process was iterative in a way that required constant attention. Because the show was storyboard driven, which we talked about earlier, the storyboard artists weren't just drawing scenes, they were writing the show's jokes, its dialogue, its emotional beats, its timing. The gap between writer and storyboard artist on Steven Universe was thin. Many of the people who contributed most significantly to what the show felt like and said were doing so through their storyboards, not through a traditional script. The Steven Bombs. The broadcast events where Cartoon Network aired 5 new episodes of the show in a single week became a significant cultural event for the fandom. The first Steven Bomb ran in March 2015, releasing 5 consecutive new episodes from Monday to Friday. They were treated by the audience as an event, which Cartoon Network subsequently leaned into. Later, Steven Bombs were accompanied by specific promotional campaigns and fan build-up. The format created a rhythm of long waits followed by intense, concentrated viewing, which suited the show's storytelling style. Each bomb tended to advance a particular story arc significantly. The Steven Bomb format was, from a storytelling perspective, a double-edged thing. It allowed the show to deliver sustained narrative momentum. 5 interconnected episodes in 5 consecutive days felt more like a short film than a weekly serialized show. But it also meant that in between bombs, the show could go weeks or even months without new episodes, which created frustration in the audience and made it harder for casual viewers to stay engaged. The fandom's intense investment in the show partly emerged from those long waits. When new content finally arrived, people were paying very close attention. The naming convention itself, Steven Bomb, became part of the show's fan vocabulary and eventually a recognizable format signal that other animated shows would reference or adopt in some form. As a broadcast innovation, it was a specific product of Steven Universe's production schedule and Cartoon Network's programming strategy, and it shaped how a generation of animated television fans thought about episode release as an experience rather than just a distribution mechanism. Seasons 2 and 3 of Steven Universe were actually produced as a single season, 26 half-hour production units, and only split into 2 separate seasons during the broadcasting process. This is why the season numbering has occasionally been a source of confusion for fans and for episode databases. The division into separate seasons was an afterthought to the production, which explains why the arc of those 2 seasons feels continuous in a way the numbers slightly obscure. According to Rebecca Sugar, she was informed in 2016 that the show would end at the conclusion of season 5. This was a Cartoon Network decision. Sugar negotiated. She asked for season 5 to be extended to 32 episodes rather than a shorter run, to give the story enough room to be properly concluded rather than rushed. Cartoon Network agreed, and also greenlit a feature film and the epilogue series alongside the extended season. The fact that the show has as complete and satisfying a conclusion as it does is partly the result of Sugar pushing back on the cancellation timeline. Steven Universe Future, the epilogue mini-series, was announced in October 2019, just weeks after the movie premiered. It ran for 20 episodes and ended in March 2020. It's worth noting that this was greenlit alongside the film, meaning the decision was made before the film even aired. Cartoon Network was willing to invest in the continuation before they knew how the film had been received. That's a meaningful vote of confidence. The series finale of the original Steven Universe, Change Your Mind, aired on January 21st, 2019. It was a 44-minute special, the longest episode in the original series by a significant margin. Most episodes run roughly 11 minutes. This one is essentially 4 episodes back to back, structured as a single continuous story. It concludes the Diamond Arc and achieves a piece that the first 5 seasons had been building toward. The decision to end the arc in a 44-minute special rather than across multiple individual episodes was the right call creatively. It allowed the climax to breathe, to move through several distinct emotional stages without the artificial stopping points that individual episode structures would have required. The scene where Steven confronts White Diamond and she tries to force him back into being Pink Diamond by literally pulling out his gem, and he survives it, just as a human, just as himself, needed to exist in a continuous, unbroken space. A commercial break or an episode cliffhanger at that moment would have diminished it. Several Steven Universe episodes were accidentally released early on the Cartoon Network app in January 2017 for Season 4. Episodes, including some with fairly significant plot developments, appeared on the app briefly before being pulled the following day. The fandom response was surprisingly calm. People who'd seen them were, by and large, careful about spoilers. The accidental early releases became a bit of fandom lore. France aired multiple Steven Universe episodes significantly ahead of the US broadcast on several occasions. This happened often enough across different seasons that it became a running joke in the English-speaking fandom, finding out that the French had already seen an episode you'd been waiting weeks for. The show's international broadcast schedule was clearly not tightly coordinated, and the leaks happened through legitimate French broadcast rather than piracy. During NYCC 2015, an episode was screened at the Steven Universe panel before its television air date, an early example of using convention screenings as premiere events for animated content. The show used SDCC and NYCC screenings several times over the course of its run as ways of rewarding dedicated fans and generating advance word of mouth for significant episodes. The storyboarding software used on the show was Toon Boom's Storyboard Pro, which is an industry standard. The reason this is worth mentioning is that in a storyboard-driven production, the storyboarding software is functionally the writing tool. The creative decisions that in a traditionally scripted show would be made in a writer's room were on Steven Universe made in Toon Boom. The software wasn't just a production tool. It was where the show's voice lived. The Steven bombs, as a broadcast strategy, are interesting to think about in retrospect. Cartoon Network had been airing episodes on irregular schedules, sometimes long gaps between new episodes, sometimes short runs of new content followed by lengthy hiatuses. The Steven Bomb format was a way of addressing the audience's frustration with those gaps by concentrating new content into event periods. 5 episodes in a week, then a hiatus, then another bomb. It created a rhythm of anticipation and release that the fandom adapted to. And it also meant that significant story arcs could be deployed in rapid sequence, 5 interconnected episodes in 5 days, creating a viewing experience closer to a short film than weekly episodic television. The storyboard-driven production model also meant that the people who drew the show were often the people most directly responsible for what it felt like emotionally. A storyboard artist who made a specific acting choice, a particular expression, a hold on a particular moment, a decision to let silence do work rather than dialogue, was making that choice at the same time as drawing it. The art and the narrative decision happen simultaneously. That's different from most production models, and it produces a specific kind of emotionally integrated animation. Several members of the crew have spoken in interviews about how much the show demanded and how much they loved working on it. The pace was genuinely fast. 6 months per episode sounds long in isolation. But in the context of running multiple episodes simultaneously in different stages of production, it translates to a production line that was always moving. There was no quiet period. The show was always being made. The people who made it gave it a lot. And that brings us to the film and the epilogue, the part of the franchise that existed after the original series ended, and that did something fairly unusual. It didn't try to be more of the same. It went somewhere different. Steven Universe. The movie was announced at San Diego Comic-Con on July 21st, 2018, which was during the original series' final season. While new episodes were still airing, it premiered on September 2nd, 2019, about 8 months after the series finale. It's set 2 years after the events of Change Your Mind, 2 years into the piece that the end of the original series established. The film introduces a new character named Spinel, who arrives on Earth in the opening minutes with the intention of destroying the planet as an act of revenge against Steven, specifically against his mother, Pink Diamond, who Spinel blames for what was done to her. Spinel had been Pink Diamond's closest companion and best friend. When Pink decided to leave Homeworld to start her life on Earth as Rose Quartz, she told Spinel to stay in the garden and wait for her. She said she'd be right back. She never came back. Spinel waited for thousands of years, frozen in a joyful pose because Pink had told her to wait without moving. She found out the truth that Pink was gone, had become Steven, that it was over, when Steven's broadcast from the season 5 finale reached her. Thousands of years of waiting. And she found out through what was essentially a public announcement. Spinel's visual design is a deliberate callback to 1930s rubber hose animation, the style of early cartoons like early Mickey Mouse and Betty Boop, exaggerated squash and stretch, extremely expressive, slightly unsettling if you look at it long enough. Her design makes her move differently from every other character in the show. She can stretch and distort and fold herself in ways that feel physically impossible even within the show's animation style, because she's drawn from a different visual vocabulary. The contrast between her and the show's more contemporary character designs is intentional and effective. Spinel is voiced by Sarah Stiles, a Tony Award-nominated Broadway actress. The role requires a performer who can do overwhelming cartoonish energy and then sudden, genuine devastation, sometimes within the same scene. Stiles pulls it off. The movie is more explicitly a musical than the original series. Where the series had songs distributed across many episodes, the film is structured more like a Broadway musical. Songs advance the plot. Characters express internal states through music. There's a full company number near the end. It has the formal structure of a stage musical even though it's animated. This makes sense given that Sugar had described Mr. Greg, the musical episode from season 3, as her favorite episode specifically because of its stage musical qualities. Steven Universe Future, the epilogue series, was announced on October 4th, 2019, just over a month after the film premiered, and began airing on December 7th, 2019. It ran for 20 episodes and concluded on March 27th, 2020. At 20 episodes, it's shorter than any individual season of the original series, and it's deliberately smaller in scope. Future is fundamentally a show about mental health, specifically about PTSD, anxiety, and the difficulty of adjusting to peace after a childhood defined by crisis. Steven spent his entire adolescence solving our other people's problems, being the person who held everything together, putting everyone else's needs before his own. And then the crises ended, and he doesn't know who he is without them. The show is very direct about this in a way that's unusual for children's animation. Little Homeworld, a community built on Earth for gems from Homeworld who want to start new lives after the Gem War ended, becomes the central setting of much of Future's lower stakes material. It's a utopian project and also a slightly melancholy one, because the existence of Little Homeworld raises questions about what healing actually looks like and whether it can ever be complete. As Steven's mental health deteriorates over the course of Future, his gem powers become unstable and destructive. When he's overwhelmed emotionally, his abilities surge in ways he can't control. The show depicts this as a physical manifestation of psychological distress, his body expressing what he can't articulate, the way anxiety and trauma actually show up in the body rather than remaining neatly contained in the mind. It's a metaphor, but it's a specific and carefully thought through one. The final episode of Steven Universe Future ends with Steven leaving Beach City. He's done the work, therapy, honest conversations, actual healing, and now he needs space to figure out who he is outside of his identity as a crystal gem and a savior. He says goodbye to everyone. It's quiet and warm and genuinely bittersweet. He doesn't have a destination. He's just going. The show trusts its audience to find that satisfying rather than frustrating, which is a specific kind of confidence. Sugar has been asked repeatedly in interviews whether Steven Universe will return in any form. Her consistent answer is that she needs a long break before she can approach that question honestly, and that she hasn't closed the door but isn't ready to open it either. Given what Future was about, exhaustion, burnout, the psychological cost of years of sustained creative effort in service of others, that answer feels autobiographical in a way that doesn't require stating. Spinell, as a character, resonated with audiences in a way that surprised some people and probably didn't surprise others. She is, in the most direct terms, a character defined by abandonment, by the specific trauma of waiting for someone who doesn't come back, of devoting yourself entirely to a relationship that one party didn't take seriously. The film doesn't excuse what she does. It also doesn't pretend her pain isn't real, or that Pink Diamond's behavior toward her wasn't genuinely harmful. She wanted a friend. She got an afterthought. That story is not abstract to a lot of people. What the movie does with Spinell's arc, giving her the chance to have her grief acknowledged, to understand the truth, to make a real choice about what she wants to be, is the show's thesis about healing expressed through a new character. You can't give her back the thousands of years she spent waiting, but you can offer her something new and let her decide. The show trusts that to be enough, and somehow it is. The tonal shift in Future from the original series is something I think doesn't get enough credit. It would have been much easier to give the audience more of what the original series did. Future commits fully to the psychological story it's telling, even when that story is uncomfortable. Steven in Future is struggling in ways that aren't heroic or dramatic, just real. The kind of struggle that requires patience and work, and the willingness to ask for help. The show didn't flinch from that. The complete collection DVD Blu-ray release was originally scheduled for November 3rd, 2020, then delayed until December 8th, 2020. It contains all 160 original series episodes, the movie, and all 20 Future episodes, along with bonus material from earlier DVD releases and new additions. It's a comprehensive physical release of a complete franchise. The art book for the movie, The Art of Steven Universe, the movie, was published by Dark Horse in March 2020. It covers the film's character design process, the development of Spinell's visual language, and the conceptual work behind the music. For anyone interested in animation production history, the art books for this franchise, there are 3 of them, covering the original series, the movie, and future separately, are genuinely excellent. Now, let's talk about the representation aspect of the show. Not as a checklist, not as a PR exercise, but because the way Steven Universe handled LGBTQ themes was genuinely unusual for mainstream children's television. And the story of how it happened and what it meant is interesting. Ruby and Sapphire's wedding, in an episode called Reunited that aired July 6, 2018, was the first same-sex wedding depicted in a major American children's animated television series. It had been building for years. Ruby and Sapphire's relationship had been quietly present since Garnet's nature was revealed in Season 1, and by Season 5, giving them a proper wedding felt like the natural culmination of that arc. The response was significant. The episode was widely celebrated. Rebecca Sugar came out at San Diego Comic-Con 2016 during a Q&A panel. She described including LGBTQ heroes in the show as coming from her own experience as a bisexual person, and expressed her desire for LGBTQ young people to grow up in a media landscape where that kind of representation is simply normal rather than noteworthy. Coming out in that setting, at a major convention, in front of a large audience while talking about the show, was a meaningful gesture. In July 2018, Sugar came out as non-binary in a radio interview with WAMU 88.5. Her pronouns are she, her, or they, them. This came about 2 years after the SDCC coming out, which had been specifically about sexual orientation. The non-binary identity added another dimension to how people understood the show's consistent interest in characters who exist outside or between conventional categories of identity. The timing of these public announcements, the sexual orientation disclosure in 2016, the non-binary disclosure in 2018, happened while the show was still airing. Sugar was making a show about identity and self-determination, and the courage to be who you actually are, while simultaneously navigating her own versions of those questions in public. The autobiographical dimension of the show's themes isn't a retrospective interpretation. It was present and active throughout the production. There's also something worth noting about how the show talked about identity without using clinical or sociological language. The gems are genderless. The show never announces this as a thesis statement. It's just the case. Characters refer to the gems with she, her pronouns as a matter of habit and politeness, not because those pronouns are essential. No episode ever stops to explain this framework. It's simply embedded in the world. Children absorbed it without having to process it as an issue. That's a pedagogically smart approach to normalization, and it worked. The show won multiple GLAAD Media Awards over its run, including recognition for the song It's Over, Isn't It? Pearl's solo from Season 3 as an outstanding musical moment. The GLAAD Awards recognize media that accurately and inclusively represents LGBTQ people and issues. Winning for a song for a specific piece of music from a children's cartoon is specific and meaningful. Pearl's storyline in the show, her devotion to Rose Quartz, the grief of losing her, the long process of figuring out who she is as a person separate from that devotion, is understood by many viewers as a specific kind of queer grief narrative. The experience of loving someone who doesn't or can't love you back in the same way, of having to remake yourself after that loss, of figuring out what you want and who you are, when the person you organized your entire identity around is gone. The show doesn't label it explicitly. It doesn't need to. The show picked up award nominations over its run, including for Primetime Emmy Awards and Annie Awards, plus recognition from the Television Critics Association. It made the best of lists. The critical establishment acknowledged it. None of this is especially surprising in retrospect, but it's worth saying because there was a period when a Cartoon Network kids' show wasn't a description that automatically invited that kind of attention. Steven Universe helped change what that sentence implied. Here comes a thought. The mindfulness song from season 4 ended up being used in actual classrooms and therapy sessions as an emotional regulation tool for children. I find that remarkable. Teachers played it. Therapists used it as a reference point. There aren't many children's shows whose songs become practical tools in therapeutic contexts. And the fact that this one did says something specific about how carefully the show engaged with emotional processing. It wasn't just emotionally resonant, it was precise enough to be useful. The show's depiction of the gems as genderless beings who present as women normalized non-binary and gender non-conforming existence for an entire generation of young viewers without ever calling it that explicitly. Children who grew up with Steven Universe absorbed a version of identity that didn't require gender to be binary or fixed before they necessarily had language for it. That kind of implicit normalization is arguably more powerful than explicit representation because it works before the viewer knows they're processing it. Sugar described garnet as a fusion of two gems in love, as a metaphor for a polyamorous relationship as well as a same-sex one. Ruby and Sapphire are individuals, and garnet is their relationship embodied. The boundaries between three distinct entities, the question of where one ends and another begins, the idea of a relationship as a third presence with its own existence. These are ideas that resonate with polyamorous experiences in specific ways. The show holds multiple meanings simultaneously. The fandom that developed around Steven Universe was, by multiple accounts, one of the more engaged and emotionally invested animated fandoms of the 2010s. They were called the Crewniverse in early years, reflecting a close relationship between fans and the production crew's social media presence. The crew shared behind-the-scenes content, engaged with fan theories, and generally maintained an unusually open dialogue with the audience. This created a fan culture that was deeply embedded in the show's production history as well as its fiction. The fact that the first Steven Universe soundtrack album charted as high as it did is, on one level, a commercial fact. But it also tells you something about how emotionally embedded the music was for the audience. People were purchasing and streaming the score as standalone listening, the way you'd listen to an album you loved. The show had built that level of investment in its music specifically. The question of what Steven Universe's legacy actually looks like, a few years on from future ending, is an interesting one to sit with. The show is often cited now in discussions about what children's animation can do, how complex its themes can be, how directly it can engage with questions of identity and trauma and emotional health, how much it can trust its audience. That conversation has expanded considerably since Steven Universe was airing. Shows that came after it, and the people who made them, were often working in a space that the show had helped open up. That's a form of influence that's hard to quantify and easy to underestimate. The fan community's specific practice of gem sonas, creating original gem characters modeled after the show's visual language, became one of the more distinctive fan creative traditions of the 2010s. Even Ivy and Sarashu participated, creating their own gem sonas and posting about them publicly. The crew's engagement with fan and creative traditions was unusual and created a feedback loop of goodwill between the production and the audience that sustained the show's fandom culture across years of irregular broadcast schedules and long hiatuses. The show's honest engagement with mental health, from Pearl's grief and difficulty moving on, to Labus's depression, to Steven's eventual PTSD and future, was described by many parents and teachers as giving them a framework and a vocabulary for conversations with children that they hadn't previously had. That kind of real-world utility is rare for fiction of any kind, let alone a children's cartoon. The show earned it. Since we're here, let's spend some time on the smaller details. The things hiding in the corners of episodes that reward people who pay close attention. Some of these are genuinely tiny. Some of them aren't tiny at all, they just look small until you connect them to everything else. Cookie Cat, the ice cream sandwich that Steven uses in the very first episode to try to activate his gem, has a small piece of lore attached to it. The in-universe Cookie Cat commercial describes a character who left his family behind. Abandonment. Leaving someone behind. The Cookie Cat brand, presented as a piece of cheerful consumer product nostalgia in the background of Steven's bedroom, is quietly describing a version of what Rose Quartz did. It's there in the first episode before any of that mythology has been established, just sitting in the background. Whether that was intentional foreshadowing or a retroactive connection is something only the writers know. Either way, once you see it, you see it. The names Lars and Sadie, the two young human characters who work at the donut shop, are taken from the folk song Last Kiss, or more precisely from names that connect to the folk music tradition of tragic romantic ballads. Their relationship across the series has a particular quality of two people who clearly care about each other and are terrible at saying so, which is exactly right for the names. Lion, Steven's magical pink lion, was once Rose Quartz's lion. This is implied and eventually confirmed across several episodes. Lion has an unexplained pink coloring that connects him visually to Rose, and he was implied to have been resurrected using Rose's healing abilities at some point before Steven was born. Lion can open portals and has a pocket dimension in its mane, both abilities that relate directly to Rose's powers. He was kept specifically for Steven, though the show is deliberately vague about the exact circumstances of when and why Rose created the Lion pocket dimension. The way the show uses Lion is interesting across the series. In early episodes, he's largely a comic presence, a large, incongruous, slightly imperious animal who follows Steven around and does what he wants when he wants to. As the show deepens its mythology, Lion's significance becomes clearer, and the scenes where he interacts with Steven's grief about his mother, the quiet moments where he just sits with Steven, or where his connection to Rose surfaces in some unexpected way, take on more weight in retrospect. He's been carrying all of that knowledge about Rose the whole time. He just can't explain it. Lion's mane contains a pocket dimension where Rose stored objects she wanted to keep safe. Steven discovers this in early season 1. Over the course of the series, he finds various things in there. A tape his mother recorded for him before he was born, his father's van at one point, a sword, and other objects. The pocket dimension as a concept, his mother leaving him a space full of things she wanted him to have, is one of the quieter, more affecting pieces of Rose's characterization. The crying breakfast friends, the in-universe children's cartoon that Steven watches, is a recurring background element throughout the show. It appears to be a cartoon about food items that are sad and cry a lot. On one level, it's a joke. On another level, if you look at the crystal gems and their situation, ancient beings trying to function as a family unit, defined by grief and difficult histories, attempting to care for a child, the parallel isn't subtle. It's a joke about the show itself, a small kind one. Onion is a recurring child character in Beach City who barely speaks, behaves in ways that are consistently inexplicable, and has several solo episodes. Onion Trade, Onion Gang, Onion Friend, that are among the most tonally bizarre things in the show. The episodes with Onion operate by different rules than the rest of the show. Things happen in them that are never explained. Onion has what appears to be a pet snake that lives in his hair. The snake is never addressed. His backstory, his inner life, his motivations, completely opaque. He's the best recurring character, probably, in terms of pure commitment to a bit. The van that Greg Universe lives in, called the Mr. Universe van, technically, because the word universe is on the side of it, is visible in many background shots across the series. Several fans have documented that the mural painted on the side of the van changes slightly in different episodes. Whether this was intentional or a consistency oversight is unclear, but it's the kind of thing that rewards people who watch carefully and notice things. Greg's relationship with his van is worth a brief aside. The van is his home, his music studio, his transport, and the physical evidence of a particular choice he made. To live small. To prioritize his music. To not be what his family expected him to be. It's also the place where Steven spent a lot of his early childhood. Whatever feelings you have about Greg as a parent, and there are reasonable debates to be had. The van represents a set of values he's consistent about. He chose this life. He chose Stephen. He chose to stay near the Crystal Temple and be available. The van is all of that at once. Fish Stew Pizza, the pizza restaurant run by the combined Fryman and Pizza families, appears in the background of beach city scenes throughout the series as a visual anchor for the town's everyday life. The restaurant itself is a consequence of an unlikely combination, which is charming. A fryman running a pizza place, a pizza family running a chip shop. They combine businesses at some point, apparently. No further explanation is provided. The visual information embedded in the gem locations, the kindergartens, the old gem buildings, the corrupted gem sites, tells you things about gem history that the show doesn't explain in dialogue for several more seasons. The prime kindergarten's layout, the specific design of ancient gem temples, the architectural language of homeworld, these were drawn with a mythology in mind from the beginning, and they reveal things if you look closely before the relevant explanations arrive. In several early Season 1 episodes, Pearl can be seen looking at Greg Universe with a particular expression, something quiet and resigned, occasionally pained. It registers as mild dislike or interpersonal tension in casual viewing. After the revelations of Season 4 and 5 about Pearl's history with Rose Quartz, those looks read completely differently. Pearl loved Rose. Greg was the person Rose chose. Pearl had to watch that, had to accept it, had to keep going. Those looks in the early episodes are the compressed version of years of grief, already there before the show has told you what they mean. The show's color palette functions as emotional information. Beach City episodes use warm, peach, coral, and amber tones, familiar, domestic, sunlit. Homeworld uses cooler blues, purples, and deep magentas. Grand, slightly clinical, vast. Emotionally intense moments tend toward more saturated, deeper versions of these same colors, the saturation increasing as the stakes do. It's not subtle if you're looking for it, but it operates below conscious awareness for most viewers. The show is telling you how to feel about a scene through color before any dialogue has been spoken. The corrupted gems that the crystal gems spend the series containing and trying to heal, the monsters they fight throughout the early seasons, are, once you know the show's mythology, the victims of the Diamond's grief attack. They're not monsters by nature. They were gems, soldiers, civilians, members of both the crystal gems and the homeworld forces, who happened to be on Earth when the Diamond attack hit. Their corruption didn't respect sides. It was indiscriminate. That retroactive knowledge changes every fight scene from the first 4 seasons. The character of Connie Maheswaran, Stephen's best friend and eventually sword-fighting partner, has parents who are initially extremely protective, to the point of unreasonableness. Her mother is a doctor. Her father is a security officer. Both have anxiety about Connie's safety that manifests as significant restrictions on her life. The show handles this with a lot of care. It doesn't make the Maheswarans villains. It shows them gradually learning to trust Connie's judgment. And it's honest about the fact that parental overprotectiveness, even when it comes from love, has real costs for the child on the receiving end. The accidental early releases of Season 4 episodes on the Cartoon Network app in January 2017 included episodes that contained significant character developments, not minor plot points. The fandom, to its credit, handled this with more grace than you might expect from an online community surprised by major spoilers. People who'd seen the episodes warned others, used spoiler tags, and generally tried to preserve the experience for those who wanted to wait for the official release. Not perfect, but better than average. The moment in the episode Stephen's Dream, a Season 4 episode where Stephen visits Korea and discovers the site of a former gem colony, and the landscape is just vast and still and marked with evidence of something that happened there thousands of years ago, is one of the show's quietly extraordinary visual achievements. It doesn't need explanation. The image does the work. The show had a consistent practice of trusting images to carry emotional weight without requiring narration or dialogue to tell you what to feel. That trust in the viewer is one of its best qualities. The way the show handles time, or the gem's relationship to time specifically, is one of its more philosophically interesting background elements. Garnet, amethyst, and pearl have been alive for thousands of years. In the show's present, they're living in a house made of a crystal temple on a beach in a small American town, helping a child with his homework and watching television. The contrast between the scale of their history and the domesticity of their daily existence is played mostly for comedy, but it has a genuine melancholy to it if you look at it long enough. What does it mean to be thousands of years old and to have found something worth staying for? That question isn't answered, it just hovers. The episode So Many Birthdays, a season 1 episode, has a specific quality that I think about occasionally. Stephen attempts to celebrate every birthday he's missed. All the years his gem age has kept him from growing normally, in a single day, and he starts aging rapidly, his physical form cycling through different ages because his belief about how old he should be is shifting faster than his body can track. It's played as a crisis, but it's also a quiet meditation on the question of how old you are when time works differently for you than it does for everyone else. The gems don't have this problem because they don't think about age. Stephen does because he's half human and human birthdays are his. The episode ends with him coming back to himself because Amethyst makes him laugh. That's the whole resolution. Laughter. Being present. It's simple and it lands. And finally, because no franchise discussion is complete without it, the extended universe. The games, the books, the merchandise, the stuff that exists alongside the show and says something about how loved it was. The first Steven Universe video game was Attack the Light, released in April 2015 for iOS and Android. It was developed by Grumpy Face Studios with Sugar's direct involvement in the creative direction. It's a tactical RPG. Players control Steven and 3 crystal gems through a series of encounters with light-based monsters. It's charming and well regarded, and the fact that it was developed for mobile platforms in 2015 with that kind of production, quality, and Sugar's active participation feels like it was made for people who genuinely cared about the show, rather than for a licensing slot. The sequel, Save the Light, came out in October 2017 for consoles, PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, later Switch and PC. It expanded on the first game's mechanics, added more characters as playable party members, and had a longer, more developed story. It was also developed with Sugar's involvement. The transition from mobile to console is significant. It's a vote of confidence in the audience's willingness to engage more deeply with the game as a game, not just as a branded product. Unleash the Light, the third game in the series, launched in November 2019 exclusively on Apple Arcade before being ported to other platforms later. It added the Off-Colors, the group of gem outcasts introduced in the original series' final season, as playable characters, which gave it a specific appeal for people who'd fallen in love with those characters during the show's run. The main art book for the original series, Steven Universe, Art and Origins, was written by Chris McDonnell and published by Abrams Books in July 2017. It covers the development of the show from initial concept through production, with concept art, early character sketches, background designs, storyboards, and written commentary from the crew. For anyone interested in animation production history or in how a show goes from an idea in someone's head to a running series, it's a genuinely detailed resource. The Art of Steven Universe. The movie was published by Dark Horse Comics in March 2020. It covers the film specifically, the development of Spinell's visual design, the production of the musical sequences, the concept work. Dark Horse has a strong history with animation art books, and the format suits the material well. Steven Universe, End of an Era, the third major art book covering future and the end of the franchise, was published by Abrams Books in October 2020. Having 3 separate art books, each covering a different phase of the franchise, is an unusual level of documentation for a children's animated series. It reflects both the density of the creative work involved and the audience's interest in the behind-the-scenes context. Funko Pop vinyl figures for Steven Universe were released in time for the 2015 holiday season, among the earlier merchandise based on the show. The Funko Pop format is interesting in the context of a show whose visual aesthetic is already quite distinctive. The figures have to translate the show's specific color palette and character shapes into a standardized vinyl format. Some of them work better than others. The Funko Pop figures, for Pearl and Garnet in particular, capture something right about those characters. There's a quality to the gem designs that translates reasonably well to the rounded minimal pop format because the characters were already drawn with that kind of simplified geometry. Amethyst's pop figure has a specific energy to it. Steven's works because Steven is already a rounded, compact character who suits the format. The merchandise as a category says something interesting about how strongly the show's characters were defined visually. They had to be distinctive enough to survive translation into a completely different visual language, and most of them managed it. The broader merchandise line, mugs, blankets, clothing, plush figures, bobbleheads, collectibles, launched in earnest in 2015 and 2016 through a range of retailers. Fat Mojo handled plush figures and foam weapons. Zag Toys did collectible bobbleheads. Just Toys offered blind bag products. Toy Factory planned a plush line the following year. Cartoon Network's own store offered branded clothing and homeware. For a fandom that was as emotionally invested as the Steven Universe audience was, having physical objects from the world of the show clearly mattered. And the last one. When you add it all up, the 5 seasons, the film, the epilogue series, the 3 art books, the 3 video games, the merchandise, the soundtracks reaching mainstream music charts, the songs being used in classrooms, the GLAAD awards, the cultural conversations about gender and representation that the show contributed to, what you have is a franchise that started with one person in an art presentation room showing drawings to Cartoon Network executives and became something that genuinely changed what people expected children's animation to be able to do and say. That's not a small thing. For a show about a kid who couldn't summon his shield. There's one more dimension to the franchise that's worth acknowledging, which is the comics. Kaboom Studios published an ongoing Steven Universe comic series alongside the show's run, with various creative teams handling stories set in the show's universe. They ranged in quality, as licensed comics often do. But at their best, they expanded on characters and situations the show didn't have time to fully explore. The Beach City human characters, in particular, got more space in the comics than they sometimes got in the show itself. The franchise's relationship with its audience over a decade is also worth noting as something relatively unusual. The original pilot was 2013, Future ended in 2020. Across those 7 years, the show maintained a relationship with its audience that managed to be both intimate, the crew's social media presence, the convention interactions, the genuine feedback loop between creators and fans, and consistently surprising. The show kept being willing to go somewhere new, to not repeat itself, to follow its story where it needed to go rather than where it would be most comfortably predictable. That combination of intimacy and surprise is hard to sustain. Steven Universe sustained it, and that's 150, more or less in order with a few detours along the way, which feels right for this kind of thing. You don't always want the perfectly efficient route. There's a lot we didn't cover tonight, if you can believe that. Connie's full character arc deserves its own video. Honestly, her journey from anxious, sheltered kid to confident young woman who makes her own choices about her own life is one of the show's quietest achievements. The off-colors, Rhodonite, Padparadsha, the Rudel twins, Fluorite, and Lars' unlikely transformation are a wonderful group of characters who got introduced late but immediately felt essential. The episode Letters to Lars, which follows Sadie adjusting to life in Beach City while Lars is away, is a small and lovely piece of work that doesn't get talked about enough. And the human residents of Beach City more broadly. Mayor Dewey, the Fryman family, Sadie's mom, the cool kids, have a collective richness that pays off if you pay attention to the background of episodes over multiple seasons. Beach City feels inhabited in a way that a lot of animated settings don't. And that comes from genuine care at the character design and writing level about even the people who don't have major story roles. There's also just the texture of the quieter episodes, the ones that don't advance the mythology or move the plot, that are just about a day in Beach City. Stephen getting a piece of gum stuck in his hair. Stephen trying to make a meal out of leftovers. Stephen and Amethyst watching a terrible marathon of a terrible show. Those episodes exist alongside the cosmic mythology episodes, and they're not padding. They're the show making the argument that ordinary life is worth caring about, that the everyday things, the small comforts, the boring afternoons, the unremarkable moments of just being with people you love have as much value as any grand adventure. That argument is central to what Steven Universe is about. And it makes those quiet episodes feel like as much of a thesis statement as anything the show does in its big emotional climaxes. If you're interested in more of this kind of thing, more lore, more production history, more sitting with shows that meant something, there'll be more videos worth checking out. And if you haven't watched Steven Universe recently, maybe this was a good reminder that it's there. It doesn't expire. It'll wait for you. If you made it here, genuinely, thank you for spending this time in Beach City. I hope it was a good place to be tonight. Sweet dreams if that's where you're headed. Take care of yourselves.